Okay, everybody, welcome to our last content lecture of the semester. So today we are going to talk about human agency, climate change, and cultural change with a particular focus on Indigenous folks. So this is a lecture that you'll want to return to when you're thinking about constructing an outline for the mandatory essay on the final exam. So I want to start out with a question for the class, which is, what do you guys think are the major threats to our environment and climate today? So if you're in class, we'll talk about this. If you're watching this online, write down a couple of ideas that you have here. And basically everywhere from high latitude tundra regions to tropical rainforests to near sea level coastlines, there are a lot of similarities in the experiences of Indigenous and local people in terms of the effects of climate change on their daily lives. Work with Inuit in northern Canada, Alaska, and Greenland shows that sea ice thinning and disappearing, as well as new types of insects, which have no name in Indigenous languages, are appearing at unprecedented levels within the region. We fail to find words to explain how Quechua people in the high Andes have talked about these kind of disappearances of their glaciers and their main water sources as a result of climate change. And similarly, in the South Pacific, islanders tell us of their fears about rising tides and the threat that diminishing coastlines and rising water tables pose to their homes. So for all of these Indigenous communities, climate change is not something that may happen in the near or far future, but is an immediate lived reality that they've been struggling to respond to. Climate change is a form of environmental colonialism at its ultimate scale. Environmental colonialism refers to the ways in which colonial practices have impacted the natural environment of Indigenous peoples. Historian Alfred Crosby coined this term, environmental colonialism, and has used it to argue that colonists were successful in part because they were able to alter native ecosystems. Colonists exposed native societies to foreign markets as well as exotic invasive species, which have restricted Indigenous peoples' abilities to defend themselves against both economic and biological invaders. Colonial powers exacerbated these problems by creating a global infrastructure that encouraged wealthier countries to extract natural resources from poorer peripheral countries. Thus, Indigenous peoples and other place-based peoples find themselves at the mercy of changes that extend far beyond their immediate control. Indigenous people argue that despite having contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, they are the ones who are most at risk from its consequences. Their livelihood systems are often vulnerable to environmental degradation and climate change, especially because they inhabit economically and politically marginal areas in already fragile ecosystems like rainforests. To Indigenous people, this means that climate change is not something that comes in isolation, but is actually a threat multiplier. Basically, a threat multiplier refers to the fact that climate change magnifies already existing problems of poverty, deterritoriality, marginalization, and non-inclusion in national and international policy-making processes and discourses. The effects of climate change are not just about communities' capacities to adapt in the face of these unprecedented environmental changes. Climate change also causes the relocation of humans, animals, and plant populations. Such relocations entail a loss of intimate human-environmental relationships that are often the grounding framework for Indigenous worldviews. In some cases, these movements of populations of animal, human, and plant life populations results in the loss of mythological symbols, meteorological orientations, and even the very mainstay of plants and animals that ground a culture. For instance, in the reading that you guys have for today, the author talked about how the sacred site of Pergorans are destroyed in the process of mine construction, leading many people in Papua New Guinea to convert to Christianity. Climate change creates disorientation, alienation, and loss of meaning in life as the environment changes. As the earth literally changes beneath their feet, it is vital to understand the cultural implications to a people's sense of homeland and place. Place plays a critical role in the cosmologies and worldviews of many indigenous communities who link knowledge to land. It follows that the loss of these places will also entail a great loss of wisdom, as well as the physical makeup of cosmologies and worldviews, as these kind of very human environment interactions serve as a kind of basis or core of indigenous cultures. Since adaptation to climate change is something that primarily takes place at the local level and deeply affects both the culture and the environment of indigenous people, it's paramount that indigenous folks define the risks and the solutions to rapid change. An exemplary text in this regard is called Voices from the Bay, which was published in 1997, and it was a report on the Hudson Bay Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Management System in northern Canada. In its approach, this report emphasized the active participation of Inuit and Cree people who live in the Hudson Bay area. The goal of this study was to document the indigenous knowledge of the environment so it could be incorporated into environmental assessments and policies. It was one of the first attempts by indigenous people to put a human face on climate change. This report also recorded indigenous observations and knowledge of environmental change, and it argued for the right of inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge in addition to environmental and ecological modeling in terms of thinking about decision making when it came to preserving the Hudson Bay bioregion. Voices from the Bay serve to illustrate that local people can contribute to identifying and understanding the dynamics of their ecosystems. And scientists became aware of how weaker currents are changing sea ice regimes. They learned about the departure of beluga whales from river mouths that had become too shallow for molting. They learned about the sensitivity of the sturgeon population to changing water quality and river diversion. And finally, they learned about the type of damage that caused freshwater diversion in the Hudson Bay region. So although this report specifically referred to climatic processes happening in the north, the far north of Canada, its relevance in terms of indigenous knowledge and incorporation definitely has a global takeaway. So one question I want to pose to the class is, why do you think policymakers have been hesitant to draw on indigenous knowledge or include indigenous stakeholders, despite the fact that these sorts of early studies have shown the importance of indigenous knowledge? I mean, really, to a large extent, international policymakers most often overlook the rights of indigenous people as well as their potentially invaluable contributions of traditional knowledge, or TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, in terms of global research. So, in addition to incorporating the voices of indigenous communities, policy responses to climate change need to be informed by a greater understanding of how potential impacts of climate change are distributed across different regions and populations. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, did an assessment that showed that the world's poor are already struggling to achieve their basic needs of food, water, and health, and will actually suffer the worst effects of climate change. This is a form of what we talked about way earlier in the class of intersectionality, the idea that you can't isolate factors like gender, economic or class, um, and race from larger questions, larger policy questions, and questions of politics. In the same context, an important sector of the poor has been repeatedly absent, that of women. So, women make up 70% of the world's inhabitants living below the poverty line. Women, in their roles as primary managers of family and food, water, and health, are really hit the hardest and must deal very directly when the impacts of climate change are brought home. For example, when a poor community in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula suffered from a hurricane, there were 3 to 4 women dead for every man. The reason for this disparity in male and female deaths was that women face different vulnerabilities and many live in conditions of social exclusion. Examples of these exclusions in the Yucatan and elsewhere include exclusion from survival skill learning, such as tree climbing and swimming, which really helps during flooding. There's also restrictions on women's movement in times of crisis, including dress codes requiring lengthy garments and prohibiting women from leaving the home without a male's permission. There's also the issue of unequal allocation of food resources to girls and women, often rendering them physically weaker in times of evacuation and crisis. In parts of the world, there has been a swell of advocacy by affected communities, particularly women, in response to the local impacts of climate change. One example is the petition to the United States by the Inuit Circumpolar Council to consider the human rights issues of climate change in the Arctic and their role in reducing greenhouse gases as a way to mitigate them. What you're seeing here is a quote from the past chair of the ICC, Sheila Watt Cloutier, who gives this testimony that explicitly calls climate change a human rights issue. Climate change issues, of course, have to be approached and resolved within a context of the interplay of multiple stressors. So there's human activities, industrial development, consumerism, resource use regulation, and larger global economic processes, which have far-reaching consequences for the environment and on indigenous and local livelihoods. While their involvement in global networks of production and consumption may provide avenues to strengthen and extend these possibilities, it also introduces greater elements of risk that make people and their livelihoods less resilient to coping with and adapting to climate impacts. Furthermore, for some people, climate change may not be the most immediately pressing issue they face, including social, cultural, economic change, which often has more immediate effects. So in the chapter that you guys read by Jerry Jacka, he talks about how anthropologists can play an important role in documenting less obvious instances of how climate change impacts local communities. So what responsibilities do you guys think anthropologists have to research their partners' experiences with climate change? So take a couple minutes in class to go through this. So one aim for anthropology is to show the complex and multi-sided ways that marginalized people are shaping and being shaped within the world system. Through the investigation of local capacities for adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change, anthropology can really tease out how larger scale processes, including industrial development, resource use, regulation, and global economic flows, can all be related to human activities and their effects on the environment. These processes tend to magnify the impacts of weather and climate variation on indigenous and local livelihoods. Not only research but policy responses should also recognize the reality that climate change is but one of several problems affecting people and their livelihoods in many parts of the world today. The issue of climate change is, of course, not a new phenomenon. Data retrieved over the last 2 decades has shown that climate change is not always gradual or cyclical, but that dramatic shifts in the climate can take place really rapidly. One of the most remarkable transitions, which had a major impact on the history of humankind, was the end of the last major cold spell, a period known as the Younger Dryas. This was a period between roughly 12,000 and 11,000 BP and was a 30-year, very brief period in which the global climate switched from cold to warm and had a major impact on the development of things like agriculture in certain areas of the world. Similarly, we see this kind of abrupt desertification of the Sahara starting about 5,000 years ago. This created a sudden and dramatic increase in windblown dust, indicative of the drying of the African continent. So you can see this whole area on the top of northern Africa is a relatively recent climatic phenomena that's created a huge swaths of desert across Africa, and that process is actually continuing into the present day with the new climatic pressures creating desertification. So today, as in the past, societies become vulnerable to millennial or continental climate changes because they don't recall or anticipate abrupt, severe climatic events. People and societies are inherently conservative. They tend to guard and cling to the paradigms, values, and institutions that have proved to be successful in their own past. As a result, they are reluctant to undertake corrective actions that go against the social grain. Because modern industrial nations overvalue industry and science, current efforts to cope with climate change focus on reducing emissions or the use of new alternative technologies instead of considering the social dimensions of climate change. So, what can the past teach us about climate change and how to address it? Take a couple minutes and think about this. I mean, to be honest, right, no society can stop climate change, but efforts can be made to minimize vulnerability to the negative impacts of climate change and to enhance the resiliency of our social systems. Any response to climate and environmental change has short and long-term consequences, and most individuals and interest groups are likely to pay more attention to their own short-term gains than society's gains at large or the gains for future generations or the planet. Archaeologists have for a long time debated the role of climate change in human affairs. For example, Gordon V. Child made one of the most influential contributions with his contention that desiccation by the end of the glacial period led to the emergence of agriculture as people congregated along river courses and within the orbit of oases, where conditions were appropriate for the domestication of plants and animals. More recently, Wise highlighted the causal role of climate and cultural evolution. Making use of high-resolution paleoclimatic data, Wise argued that climate change has been a primary agent in repeated social collapse. In the time that I have left today, I just want to review how climatic events have been linked to social developments, particularly focusing on a case study of the Maya in Central America. So the rise of social complexity appears in the first place as a mechanism to buffer shortages in agrarian productivity within an ecological context that has the potential to accommodate a large population. The initial strategy of pooling resources was intended to even out the chance of loss of crop yield by a single household or village. Since food security is enhanced as the number of participants increase, the temptation to kind of expand the number of joint villages also increases. However, This process requires specialized managers, leading to an increase in the number of non-food producing elites who consolidate their power through these kind of lavish displays of wealth and craft specialty. Such dramatic increases in the non-food producing sector places a premium on progressively higher crop yields. Meeting the rising demand may be accomplished through conquest, slavery, overtaxation, or encouraging population growth. Complex agrarian societies are highly vulnerable to internal as well as external threats. Internal challenges may result from mismanagement, rivalries among elite groups, or revolts. Alternatively, external challenges may be due to adverse, unforeseen consequences of farming, like salination, erosion, and pollution, as well as by attacks by foreign enemies or climate change under this current system. In the case of climate change, the impacts of this threat is made more or less severe by how quickly the environment can recover in response to these changes. Give one example here of how a complex agricultural society has been impacted by climate change. So we can look at this example from Central America, where we see a transition from wet to arid conditions that fundamentally impacted the social system and its cultural development. The shift to farming and canal irrigation in South and Central America happened around 3000 BP and coincided with a move away from hyper-arid conditions to moister climate and return of rain-fed lakes. The period between 3500 and 1800 BP was generally wet. However, a series of arid events occurred in 862, 986, and 1051. Scholars attribute the classic Maya collapse, which took place between 750 and 830, to drought during this period. They also note that other cultures in South and Mesoamerica experienced declines at or near the same time that the classic Maya society collapsed. For example, we see the abandonment of Teotihuacan in Mexico around 750 to 800, and we also see the collapse of the Andean society of Tiwanaku around 1000. Similarly, the prominent pre-Hispanic culture of the Moche, with its heavy dependence on large-scale irrigation, experienced an upheaval and collapse as a result of a series of severe 6th century droughts. There are, however, reasons not to single out climate change as the only cause for the collapse of the classic Maya. For example, the classic Maya civilization developed under arid conditions and is thus likely to have developed mechanisms for how to cope with some degree of drought. Also, the collapse may be explained in part by a shift in organizational strategy or population movements. Scholars suggest that there was likely both climatic and social factors at play, arguing that the collapse was primarily caused by what might be called cultural gigantism. The classic Maya depended on an elaborate system of waterworks and controls by elites, who continued to aggrandize their civic centers, creating a superstate in a fragile, dry, subtropical environment. Their growth was unsustainable, and severe drought would have only hastened the civilization's demise. Societies are often adapted to fluctuations in climate, but are not immune from environmental stresses caused by severe, abrupt climate events. Nevertheless, abrupt climatic events do not determine cultural change, which ultimately depends on local ecological conditions, cultural norms, social dynamics, as well as technology, economy, and ideology. Climate change is also only one of many variables that can lead to collapse of a complex society. What is important and potentially fruitful is to expose the structural weakness in a complex society that can hasten its breakdown and increase its vulnerability to climate change. Today, the mesmerizing depiction of climate change as this culprit that will bring our civilizations down should not lead us to think that climate change is the only threat to humanity. It should, in fact, make us realize that we have created a social system that appears to be highly vulnerable to climate change. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. The answer to the D2L quiz is Timbuktu is blue. Make sure to fill out quiz number 28. It's your last attendance quiz of the semester. And I'll see you guys all hopefully at the final exam review on May 3rd.